So I'm Katie, and I'm the exercise physiology piece to this.
And I'm Christopher. I am the sport management side of things.
All right, so a little bit of background on our information. Obviously, this is an obesity prevention intervention. So there, as we know, is a lot of issues with our youth today being very inactive. One of the main things that I really wanted to highlight is we have those younger individuals, 6 to 11, 42% of them actually meet the MVPA, which stands for moderate to vigorous physical activity requirements. But then as they get a little bit older, it gets even worse. So that's kind of one of the things we wanted to intervene at a younger age to see if basically what we're doing will actually help them in the long run keep up those physical activity levels. So going through, there's a lot of cardiometabolic risk factors that these youth should not have. Ideally, all these percentages should be 0. So they shouldn't have any issues with insulin sensitivity, with any like body fat percentage or anything along that line, as well as their aerobic capacity. So our objective is to create a program that will address this, and previous studies have kind of shown whole class obesity programs to be effective for doing things like this. So our problem with this is that few of these target low socioeconomic status individuals, so we wanted to go in with that intervention group, and then a lot of these current school-based interventions have yielded kind of inconsistent short-term results, and that's part of the problem that we wanted to tackle with this.
As well, the literature in sport management suggests that there's a disconnect between physical activity and sport management research. So this seems very applicable to physical activity and taking care of sport management research, and it calls for more participatory research, which is what we're identifying here. So our purpose of this study is to increase sport learning outcomes and improve health-related fitness variables among low socioeconomic status elementary school second grade students in partnership with local collegiate soccer teams. So sport for development theory and interorganizational relationship theory will be utilized in the framework of this partnership, and we'll get into that in a little bit later, so it'll make more sense.
All right, so you might be wondering, why are we choosing soccer as our sport for our intervention? So for one, youth sports, they contribute to an average of 45 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So obviously sporting is fun for children. It's not just some exercise that they come in and do. They're very involved, very active. Soccer itself has a lot more physical activity within the sport itself compared to things like baseball and softball and other team sports. So it's something that will really get them active that we would hope would also raise their activity levels. It has a low equipment cost and it's non-gender specific. So if we are intending to implement this with low socioeconomic kids and we give them some sport like hockey or something that costs a lot, that's completely impractical. Whereas soccer, all they really need is a ball. You can make your own nets if you want to outside of this. So it's just something that's a lot more practical for them.
And sometimes make your own ball, to be honest. So sport for development comes into it because, well, one of the ideas with sports for development is the United Nations Global Challenges, where they focus on developing countries and trying to implement programs to increase whatever you have, maybe it be peace, whatever. But there's also an aspect that has to deal with marginalized groups of disadvantaged communities. So that is why we are looking at the social economic status of these children. So. That's yours.
All right, so we looked at some different interventions, some of them having to do with lower socioeconomic status, and then some of them just generally with physical activity interventions, just only the physical activity, because there are some combination ones as well. So the first one is the PALS study, Physical Activity Leaders. This is a program for adolescent boys from disadvantaged schools. So it's 14-year-olds, it was a multi-component intervention, so it also involves social cognitive theory, it involved learning with them, it involved nutrition, so it's a little challenging to differentiate just the physical activity piece, but like we said, there weren't really many studies that actually involved low socioeconomic status groups, so this was one of the few that we actually found. Their primary outcome was BMI. They did find significant changes within this group. The next one that I looked at, just to get the idea of specifically physical activity interventions within children, showed that 5 out of the 15 showed statistically significant results in BMI, which is one of the more easy things to actually measure. 4 out of 5 of them had a mean age of less than 9 years old, which, as you will find a little bit later, is our target group. And then it aimed at weight loss in minority low-income children, and decreasing skin fold thicknesses, so that's more of the body fat percentage of things, which I personally believe is a more accurate measure than just BMI. And then the last one I looked at was effective multi-level, multi-sector, school-based obesity prevention program. So nice mouthful of things there. So this one was another holistic intervention. Like I said, these are one of the things that we can actually find with these individuals. It did involve 8-year-old children, and it had 4 interventions and 1 control group. So you actually had a little bit better idea of how well this was working within them, although having 1 control can be a little bit limiting if they from the get-go are a little bit different from your intervention groups. Oh, and then this one is our group members. So this is the part we're not as familiar with. A lot of what she does has to do with beta waves. So the basic idea to all of this is that you can look at these band waves in order to figure out if somebody is learning or not. So a lot of times we'll do that with videos or different imagery and things like that. So the idea behind her piece is that we can assess the learning process from this program.
And then when learning, you'd be more inclined to utilize that skill, is the idea. In terms of the sport for development and the interorganizational relationship literature, midnight basketball is a piece that people have used quite often in the literature. But although the data from early adopting cities does suggest that there's a correlation between the drop in property crime and the increase in these programs, some scholars disagree, and there are many confounding variables, which is something that we'll get at because it's kind of at the heart of what we're doing here. Also, Sport for Development integrated literature review shows us that most focus on social educational outcomes, often the qualitative sort. So again, we're using a mixed method approach here to combat that. And then you have this core periphery issue where most of the studies are done on Africa, Asia, Latin America, but they're done by scholars from North America or Europe and Australia. So you have a disconnect there from just the scholar study kind of thing. And then it's a very young field, so clear evaluation methods are actually not quite present in sport for development. So to address that, I look at interorganizational relationship literature and identified determinants based on Oliver, 1990. They have 6 determinants they use kind of to evaluate interorganizational relationships, and many of that has been used actually in sport literature, Babiak-Willem. And then we believe that the 2 determinants that will create a strong partnership would be based on reciprocity and stability. So we looked at more specific sport for development interventions that seem to be associated with kind of what we're doing. There was one on Papua New Guinea-based sport for development study that had to do with non-communicable diseases, although as you see there was no true control group. Actually, the literature actually mentioned that. And the control school was very different in age and activity, so it was hard to compare the 2. Sport for development with street soccer and cardio health and homeless men. Well, that does not really evaluate at all levels like we're attempting to do. And we're looking at the program level, we're looking at the learning level, and we're looking at the physical activity level. So all 3 of those areas could possibly be a problem when you're looking at a program, the success or the failure of it, but nobody has studied those 3 different levels. And then the impact of the NFL Play 60 on elementary students. Now that is a very, 100 schools in 22 states, that's very significant. It says there was no funding from the NFL, but I find that hard to believe, but I will take that at face value. The data suggests that preliminary evidence in that program promotes better health, but that, again, is at the 1 level, the physical activity. We don't know about the skill, and we don't know about the program success.
All right, so our research questions all kind of go along with what Chris just mentioned. So does this intervention increase soccer skill learning, so our learning component to it? Are learning outcomes positively correlated with physical activity levels? So while we're looking at learning and understanding whether or not they learn, we need to know, does this actually have a connect with physical activity? Then does this intervention improve health-related fitness variables? So kind of like we discussed earlier, looking at body fat percentage, aerobic capacity, things like that, that will all correlate to to disease decreases. And then which IOR determinants, if any, are observed in the Sport for Development Partnership.
And then the intervention, these are the hypotheses that we are expecting. The intervention will increase soccer skill learning. Learning outcomes are positively correlated with PA levels. Body fat percentage, BMI, aerobic capacity, and physical activity will improve. And then if a good parent, we expect determinants of reciprocity and stability to be visible in our thematic analysis.
All right, so for our program design, this is going to be a mixed methods portion to it. We're going to have 4 schools in the same school district that are all from low SES groups. 2 of these are going to be a control, 2 will be an intervention. They'll be randomly assigned to these particular groups. We're going to have a quantitative portion, so that's going to be the physiological portion to it, and then also the learning portion to it. And then those will be blinded. And then the second one we're going to have is qualitative. So that's going to be semi-structured interviews for the sport for development side of things. Those cannot be blinded, obviously, because you have to talk to those individuals. So going through these, it will take place every day for 1 hour during the PE classes. Their learning component will be within approximately the first 15 minutes. All of these will be delivered by our collegiate soccer partners. So we're hoping with that it's going to be fun for the kids. They get to see people that they look up to within this, and then they'll actually have a relationship with that individual. And then the next thing is going to be the measurement time point. So we'll have one at the very beginning of it, one at the very end. We won't have any in between because we don't want any learning of the actual tasks that these children are doing, primarily with the learning component to it. So that will kind of help reduce that as being an issue. And then hopefully within these we'll get approximately 100 children per school, so we have a decent sample size to compare.
And then the proposed methods: population, elementary school children, second graders, and then that would obviously require IRB and school district approval. The rationale for choosing these low SES second graders really before puberty, capable of paying attention. I have a second grader myself, and he's just at the fringe, so I figured we could start doing that. And then less likely to have a mastery of the sport. So that goes along with that learning idea. We're trying to teach them and they can learn it, and then that learning would lead to physical activity.
All right, so our measures, the physiological ones are going to be relatively standard plus a little bit more information. So we're going to be using DEXA, which is dual X-ray energy absorptiometry, the gold standard for a body composition analysis. With this, it allows us to get accurate measures of body fat percentage and also visceral adipose tissue, which that has been strongly correlated with being indicative of cardiometabolic diseases. So if we can kind of measure even just a change in that over time, that will be highly beneficial. We'll also be looking at the performance measures. So a 1 mile run test, that's not obviously the gold standard of doing an actual VO2 max test, but that would take far too long with all these children. And then this has already been proven to be a relatively accurate indicator for us. And then we'll also be doing an accelerometer. So a 1 week assessment in the very beginning and then one in the very end. And then the next one's going to be our partners. She's going to be looking at the learning assessment of beta band suppression. So as we said, that's going to be a scale for her to be indicative of learning or not.
And then the Sport for Development IOR is really just the pre and post semi-structured interviews with the college athletic program that happens to be in connection with the educational physical education program. And then a thematic analysis done to isolate commonalities, and then that'll be based, again, on Oliver 1990. Expected findings and significance. Really, it fills various literature gaps that we have identified earlier in this presentation and allows for evaluation of multiple levels. As I said, you have that learning level, you have the physical education level, and then you have the program in itself. We're trying to identify where things are going right, where things are going wrong, in order to be able to implement programs like this. And that is something that hasn't been done before. If successful, we'd like to think that policymakers at the state or federal level would implement the program in other low SES school districts throughout the state and country. And we think that because it is a college and elementary school connection, those are more probable of happening than a professional and an elementary school connection, because there are simply more colleges. The program could be adapted for the use in other countries, but we would like to see scholars from those countries implementing this particular thing within that. And then the grand challenges, obviously, it addresses advancing health through the tailored solutions.
All right, last of all, potential funding opportunities. So this would begin within the U.S. to see if this is successful. So we were looking at the National Institute of Health. They have their own group that actually looks at obesity prevention programs and helps implement that. The school improvement grants, and then also the CDC's section for obesity as well. And here's our references. Going through. And what questions do we have? Yeah.
So you didn't do the intervention for a year long every day during PE?
Yep, it'll just replace their physical activity, like normal PE courses. Instead, they'll be doing like skill learning and soccer every day.
Okay, so why not, like, PE I know is like very important, like they do other physical activity, and then why not doing after school based program rather than taking away PE time?
Well, it's also really hard. So within these lower SES groups, you also have to consider the fact that these parents might work very different jobs and it might be very challenging for them, and their children have to ride the bus home. So at that point, it just makes it a lot easier on all parties involved. It's just in the school program. We don't have any kind of overlap with things learning in PE that would kind of take out our intervention. So we can't really evaluate the effectiveness of our program versus the PE classes. So it's more for kind of convenience for the parents was our idea behind it.
I have a question related to feasibility.
Mhm.
Are there other studies that you didn't talk about that did go in and change PE? 'Cause I know a lot of schools would be resistant to letting somebody else dictate their PEs, but I don't know if other studies have shown.
Yeah, so some of the ones that I actually talked about, like the PALS study, incorporated it in their PE classes, and then they had a little bit older children, so they also integrated a program where they could kind of advance through, and they used things like boxing in their PE programs, some other sports as well, so they mixed in different ones, and then they could also have their kids get certified to be like teachers of these things as well as a component to it. So they did incorporate that in their PE classes and found it to be very successful.
So I saw it's very interesting that you proposed working with local university team, soccer team. Could you talk a little more about the justification behind that, and is this going to be a part of evaluation in working with the local university team?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, part of the evaluation is whether the program partnership was successful. So we will talk with the athletic department within the soccer organizations. As I said, we were talking earlier, and we talked about how we chose soccer due to the both genders represented within the athletic program, and the feasibility based on the price, the cost to do it. But I think one of the reasons that we chose to do college rather than, again, a professional sport is that, I mean, if you look at the Big Four or what have you, you only have a limited amount of metropolitan areas that have that. You can have very small towns that have both a men's and women's soccer program at their university, and that could be implemented. So that was one of the choices that we made is we do this here first here in Minneapolis, but the idea was that maybe it could grow elsewhere, and one of the conscious choices that we made was based on the college programs. Yeah.
I have another question about, like, a lot of my personal view, like a lot of problems I see with research is that there's a group of researchers coming in a low-income minority group. They bring in research, they do the project, they leave. So how do you ensure that consistency of, like, because I know physical activity is very important. How do you ensure that consistency will continue the next further years?
Sure.
The second, the third, the fourth, continuing.
Well, I mean, I would say that is one of the reasons that it is for an entire year.
Yeah.
That's one of the knocks on sport for development, to be honest. A bunch of white guys who play soccer come in and they teach us how to play soccer. Great, that's awesome, and then they leave. Well, what good does that do? This tries to combat that by making it at least a year-long process, and our hope is that the partnership is strong enough that you can then just continue on. Whether that be continuing on with the soccer program, or maybe it moves to a different sport, as all these second graders have already mastered soccer. But I mean, that's the plan, trying to make it, a longer. I mean, that's one of the reasons that we chose to do a longer study. Anything else? Yeah.
Yep. Thank you for your presentation. I appreciated hearing all of them try to pull different areas of education teacher by training. So let's assume I'm the teacher at this school that you're approaching. How would you convince me, I wrote down, what makes it better or different than my usual physical education program in terms of your specific outcomes of learning, physical activity, heart rate? You have to
Sure.
convince me. What would you say?
Okay. That sounds like you.
Sounds like me. All right. So some of the different pieces that we were hoping for one, I worked with children too. I did it in a sports context. And the way they look up to older athletes is just amazing. Like they bow before them. They think they're the coolest people ever. So part of what we were hoping for is to build relationships with those individuals that are coming in. Obviously, we didn't include it as an assessment, but we know that when you have other individuals coming in, building these relationships with kids, building their passion for it, that's going to make it a little bit different than just kind of following rules. It makes it more playful, compassionate, personable. So we were hoping with that component, that's what would kind of help juice it up from the PE level. And then also so that they have some skill mastery with it. With PE classes, a lot of times, at least from my personal experience, you go through all these different sports and you never master a single one of them. So you're just kind of going through learning a few different things, but you don't actually learn anything enough to be able to understand all the rules of the sport, to understand all the pieces to it so that you can take it outside of the classroom and continue to play. So the idea is that once they leave the school, then they can still play soccer with their friends. They know the rules, they understand the concepts, they can show off their cool skills. So we were hoping with this and the sport mastery and learning that it would really help increase physical activity outside of the school too.
Okay, thank you. And two more quick questions.
Mhm.
How about facilities? We're in Minnesota. I'm teaching PE most of the time in poor weather. Can we do what you're talking about in the gym?
Oh, yeah.
PE class?
Oh yeah, you totally can. Only hard thing is going to be ball handling and making sure that they're pretty good at that, but fortunately you'll start in the fall so you can be outside and hopefully they've mastered it a little bit. I've also worked inside. Obviously you have to cover your lights, you have to make sure there are no windows because kids obviously kick balls a little bit out of the way, but there is enough room for them to set up like cones for doing skill sets for it, to be able to set up a temporary soccer area so it'll be a little bit more like other indoor games where you set up cones on the end or things like that to actually help kind of outline their soccer area. So.
Okay, thank you. And third quick question, could you tell me a little bit more about the reciprocity, stability? I kind of missed what is it IOR?
Yeah.
What's
Yep.
IOR again?
The interorganizational relationships is the theoretical background for it. And there are 6 determinants. There are necessity, asymmetry, reciprocity, efficiency, stability, and legitimacy. So when it comes down to this relationship, I would expect to see reciprocity and stability. So just from a college athletic standpoint, well, they hope to partner with the educational entity and think, well, maybe we can end up with more people coming to our sporting events, or maybe we can even end up with more people coming to our university based on this particular partnership. Meanwhile, obviously, the educational institution gains these athletes that are looked at like gods by the kids. So you have this reciprocity between the two, and you also have and the stability would be based on, well, you take a pre and post interview and you say, what are your expectations? What are your goals for this? And then were your goals met? And if your goals aren't met, then you probably have less interest in continuing that and having stability of that program. And it is essential, obviously, for a long-term partnership that you have that. So those would be the two things that I'd be looking for.